So why this one? Why this story, this reading in the Torah? I mean, every year we gather, not just here, but Jews gather all around the world, and they read this story. We put on our New Year best, we take a day off from work, we cook and prepare a special meal, and we come like a biblical pilgrimage to sit in shul. And the story we tell, the story that we read is this: of a father who takes his son away in secret, doesn't tell his wife, takes him to a mountaintop because God told him to, binds him with rope, places him on a pile of wood, and takes a knife to his throat. Why are we reading this? I don't get it. We could read anything. We are, and some of you may be feeling this right now, we are a captive audience. I mean, Noah would be nice. It's got cute, furry animals. They go on the ark 2 by 2. That's a good story. The 10 Commandments. Now, there's a story. It was so good they made a movie out of it. We could read of Jacob and Esau, those 2 brothers that fought with each other almost their entire lives, but then in that last moment they reconcile. They fall on each other's necks. They kiss each other. That's a message for the High Holy Days, of the importance of family and of confronting hurt feelings, of love, and I'm saying I'm sorry. So why this story? Why the Akedah? Why the binding of Isaac? I truly don't get it. Why do we need to hear this of all lessons from the Torah on this day of all days? I mean, first, there's the premise of the story itself, that God would test a person's faith. I mean, just think. That God would test a person's faith by asking that person to sacrifice their son. I mean, could we believe in a God that does that? And second, and perhaps this is even more troubling, that a model of Jewish faith is to believe in a God that would ask such a thing of a human being. And third, there is no doubt, not in our mind's eye or in God's, that had the angel not called out, Avraham, Avraham, Abraham, Abraham, he would have taken that knife and he would have done that horrible deed. And if the angel had not intervened, if the angel had not called out to stop his hand, that deed would have been a mitzvah, an act commanded and sanctioned by God. Year after year we read this story, and I know you are like me. Year after year you turn to somebody next to you as you're reading the translation or understanding the Hebrew, and you say to them, if a man did such a thing to his son in this day and age and said that God had told him to do it, the RCMP would be knocking at his door. They would lock him up. They would throw away the key, if not much worse. Right? Right. So why do we read this story? Let me suggest that maybe we read it because it is so incredibly extreme and yet so obviously possible that we must challenge ourselves to understand what is going on here. We must challenge ourselves to understand why Abraham, why Isaac, why Sarah, why God would act in this way. We read this story, this most sacred of stories in our Torah, because it demands empathy. It demands empathy. What Australian psychotherapist Alfred Adler described as seeing with the eyes of another, listening with the ears of another, feeling with the heart of another. We read this story because we will interact with people as enthralled as Abraham was at that moment, because he was blinded by faith. Be that faith in God, or money, or power, or authority, or political ideology. People who act with such self-righteousness that they think that the laws of humanity, let alone the laws of common decency, don't apply to them. Think of political extremists, religious zealots. Before we write them off as irrational, remember Abraham. Remember why he got up early in the morning in that story. Because his story is a lens to understanding theirs more clearly. We read this story because we know Isaac's in our lives. People whose past traumas color their present days and on into their futures. Remember, decades later, it was a diminished Isaac who was literally and figuratively blind to the scheming and the trickery of his wife and his sons Jacob and Esau. And so when we see a parent who plays favorites with their child, or who is withdrawn or absent from their child's life, or who is short on patience or maybe overly critical, before we label them as terrible parents, empathy compels us. Remember Isaac. We are all, for better or for worse, products of our childhood experiences. What is present is so often an echo of our past. And we read this story because we have friends who are like Sarah, a wife who has been deceived by her husband, who wakes up to find her world torn to pieces, her trust invalidated and beyond recovery. The very next parsha in this Torah tells of Sarah's death. It's called Hayei Sarah, but it speaks nothing of her life and only of her death. It implies that this ultimate betrayal by the man that she loved, it broke her heart, it crushed her spirit, and it took away her will to live. How many stand on that threshold like Sarah? They can't trust their spouse anymore. Where is that wonderful person that they married? And what do? Do they walk away? And what will become of them if they do? How can they go on living when everything that they lived for has been a lie or a deception? Sarah's torment is real. It is current. And it is sadly happening to people that we know, people that we care about. Her story illuminates their reality, and maybe for some of us, our own reality. We read it also because if we are perceptive, if we pay attention in life, we will encounter angels. Not the winged angels of Hollywood with the halo and the wings and they flutter around. That's not a Jewish angel. But angels like that one that called out urgently to Abraham to withhold the knife. Angels that call out to him not once but twice. The first time he only heard his name. The second time, though, Abraham listened. What changes in us? What changes in us when we go from, I hear you, to, I'm listening to you? What changes? Have you ever failed to be receptive to good advice or criticism when it was offered in your own best interest? Have you? Who among us hasn't? Of course we have. We hear, but we don't always listen. Abraham almost missed it. He really did. He was so intent on his course of action, as ruinous and destructive as it was, or as it would be, that the angel had to call out to him twice to get his attention. Avraham! Avraham! That got him to listen. Sometimes we are that angel. Sometimes we are that angel for another, calling out to save a friend from a terrible mistake. And we may have to yell, and we may have to scream, and we may have to jump up and down to get their attention. Avraham, Avraham. To get them to not only hear, to get them to listen. And they may hate us for it. They do sometimes. But empathy, standing in the shoes of another person, compels us, commands us to take that dramatic step to intervene, to help. Which reminds me, by the way, of an aside. Comedian Steve Martin's line about empathy is one of my favorite Martin said, before you criticize a man, walk a mile in his shoes. That way, when you do criticize him, you'll be a mile away and you'll have his shoes. We read this story, as troubling as it is, because it challenges us to have a very difficult thing, but an important thing, the most important thing. It challenges us to have empathy. To see the characters of this story with empathic eyes is difficult. To listen to them with an empathic ear is hard to hear. And to understand them with an empathic heart takes a lot of work. Empathy is not only the key to understanding the Akedah, understanding this Torah portion, it is the essence of what it means to be a Jew. Empathy is the essence of what it means to be a Jew. Hillel said it most succinctly. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. Every religious tradition has its own version of this, what has become known as the Golden Rule. But Judaism's construct is different and important in its distinction. It demands that I step outside of myself and that I make this assessment not sometime, but every time that I'm about to interact with others. And that is not easy, because there's this little thing, which is not so little, called ego. The us, the me, that gets in the way of seeing you. Rabbi Yitzhak Meir of Gur observed that the greatest darkness exists when we can't see each other, when we can't appreciate each other's pain. And he said this commenting on the 9th plague. Remember that from Seder? We dip out the drops of wine, the 9th plague, Hoshech. We drop that wine out and we say, what's so wrong with Hoshech, darkness? I mean, it's not cattle disease, it's not boils or lice or the killing of the firstborn, it's darkness. What's so horrible about darkness? And so we read in Torah what was so horrible about darkness. And Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all of the land of Egypt for 3 days. And they could not see one another. And neither did anyone rise from his place. If we never see the need in the first place, we won't move. We won't lift a hand, not a finger to help. We practice blind indifference. The darkness is self-imposed. This Torah portion cries out to us, look, open your eyes and see. Look what human beings are going through. Look what they are doing to each other. Look what they are feeling about and for each other. And Judaism commands us, notice them. Notice them. Have empathy for them, for each other. Judge each other with empathy. Act towards each other with empathy. Treat each other with empathy. Empathy is why we will fast on Yom Kippur in 10 days' time, so that we will understand the pain and the hunger of those for whom they don't have a choice whether to eat another meal or not. Empathy is why this congregation turns no one away because of financial need. Because they could be us. Indeed, for many of us, when we were just starting out, they are us, or were us. Temple Sholom had empathy for us then, and we will continue to have it. We will continue to have it for those who enter these doors, even if it means that all of us have to give a little bit more. And empathy is why I say proudly from this bima that if you are an interfaith family, trying to have a Jewish home, trying to raise a Jewish child, You are welcome here at Temple Sholom. We support you. I support you. We value you. I value you. We embrace you. I embrace you. Because it is the reality of the world that we live in, the Jewish world that we live in. And our doors are open, our arms and our hearts are open. They are not closed. We see, we hear, we listen. Empathy is the essence of what it means to be a Jew. To be a Jew means to feel empathy for the world and the people that are in it. To understand its tragedies, because they have happened to us. And we are commanded not only never again, we are commanded to never forget. To never forget that we too were once slaves in the land of Egypt. To see the world through that lens of our own experience is empathy. Empathy is the very meaning of God's name that we use on these high holy days. We just said it. We just chanted it in front of the ark. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'Chanun Adonai. The Lord, a God compassionate and gracious. It too is a verse that comes from Exodus. Shortly after those plagues, during the story of the golden calf, Moses is bereft and despondent over the betrayal of the Jewish people, by the Jewish people, of him. He feels as though he's been bullied and rejected by them. At the moment that he needed them the most, he went away, he came back, and they were dancing to a golden calf. He had schlepped them out of Egypt. He had led them through the seas. He had brought them to that moment. He comes down with Torah, and it is as though they forgot him. It is as though they didn't care. And he crushes those commandments. He shatters them. In anger and frustration, we can imagine that. Empathy says we could put ourselves even in Moses' sandals in that moment. We would do the same thing, if not worse. But Adonai El Rachum v'Chanun, but God, who is empathy in his name, comforts and consoles Moses. God stands in Moses' sandals and says, Moses, this whole thing is not about me. This is about you. Moses, God says, Moses, you feel abandoned by the people that you risk so much for. It's a maternal moment for God. He comforts Moses as a parent comforts a crestfallen child, no matter their age. You hurt, therefore I weep. That's parenthood, right? Across distances, miles, oceans, you hurt, I weep. Over a phone, over Skype, you hurt, I weep. Over email, you hurt, I weep. Because you're my kid no matter what. No matter how old, no matter where you are, you hurt, I weep. The name Rachum or Rachamim, it's one of the 70 names for God. God's very name is empathy. And it's a lens into the importance of empathy in Judaism, to the very nature of God. Its root, and get this, this is beautiful. Its root is the word rechem. Rechem means womb. Womb. Empathy in Judaism is to feel for another as though they were your own child, as though they issued from you. It's not enough merely to say, that person is a fellow human being, and I should help them. It's not even enough to say that that person is my brother, and I should help him. No, our tradition commands us to see every person as God sees them, as God sees us, as though they issued from our own womb, to say that person is somebody's child, to say that stranger could be my child. Because everybody, including, no, actually especially, the homeless person that you will drive by today on your way to go to your Rosh Hashanah lunch, is somebody's child. Rachamim, empathy, God's name, requires that as Jews, as an extension of God's maternal empathy, we must help them. We must help others. For we all have the same parent. We are all children of God. We say on these high holy days that God sits on the throne of Din, over here, on the throne of judgment. But before God sits on the throne of Din, God first sits on the throne of Rachamim, of the throne of empathy and compassion. And God feels empathy for our lot. Before God judges us over here on Din, God tries to understand us here from the place of Rachamim, from empathy. And it's an amazing image that God tries to understand us before God judges us. And it's a profound example for us all. Think about it for a moment. From Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, God comes and sits down beside us in that empty chair that is next to you, on your sofa, in your home. God sits next to you and puts God's arm around you and says, tell me how you're feeling. Tell me about how you hurt. Tell me what you did. I want to understand. I care. I'm listening. That is empathy. Before we judge another, we must understand them. And how many of us are guilty of just doing the opposite? Of judging first and understanding second or third, or maybe never. Maybe we never understand. We don't understand at all. And so a story. When a 19th century shtetl was beset by a freezing cold, the rabbi, the Rebbe of this community, was greatly concerned for the poor because they had no money to heat their homes, to buy fuel, to buy fire, to buy oil. And so the Rebbe set off for the home of the town's richest man, and he knocked on the door. And the man came to the door and he said, Rabbi, come in, come in. The rabbi declined and said, no, I need only a minute or two of your time. We can talk here on your porch outside. So the Rebbe started to ask the man some general questions about his family, his children, small talk. The man who had come to the door in his pajamas began to shiver. His teeth began to chatter. Will the Rebbe please come inside? Please, come inside. The Rebbe said no, and he then began to ask the man questions about his business and how things were going. The man was now visibly shivering from the cold, and he again said, will the Rebbe please come inside? Tell me why you have come to my house, please. The Rebbe remained outside, and he told the man, I've come to ask you for 100 rubles. We need the money to warm the homes of the poor in this cold winter. And if I promise, Rebbe, if I promise to give you the money, will you come inside? Yes, said the Rebbe. Then I'll give you the money right now. Just please come inside. I'm freezing to death out here. And after the Rebbe followed the shivering man inside, the man went and opened up his safe and gave the Rebbe the 100 rubles. And as he gave it to him and he asked, he said, Rebbe, if you knew all along that you were going to ask me for this money, why didn't you just come out and say it? And the Rebbe answered, if I had come in as soon as you had opened up the door, you would have escorted me to a fine chair by your warm fire. We would have shared a warm glass of tea in your living room. We would have warmed ourselves. And when I had asked you then for the money for the poor to heat their homes, you would have offered me 5 rubles, maybe 10 rubles. But standing outside, you experienced for just a few minutes the bitterness of cold that the poor are experiencing all the time. And I wanted you to feel what it feels like to be cold when I asked you for 100 rubles to warm their homes. It is a story of empathy, but it has a very troubling subtext. For it's not until the man feels the bitter pain of cold himself that he is compelled to act on behalf of the poor. He could not understand the needs of the poor, and therefore he couldn't empathize with them. Only when he was victimized by that same cold was he able to empathize. And we shouldn't have to be victimized in order to empathize. We shouldn't have to experience divorce, mental illness, death of a loved one, a disabled child in order to recognize that pain and provide comfort. We shouldn't have to be lost and alone in order to help our spouse when they are feeling lost and alone. We shouldn't have to have a gay child in order to empathize with the ongoing struggle for gay rights and acceptance. If the standard for empathy is that we have to be victimized in order to empathize, then I guess we will have to have a whole lot more poor, a whole lot more hungry, a whole lot more wounded and sick and lonely and depressed in our world before we can have fewer. As Gandhi famously said, an eye for an eye will make the whole world blind. The mitzvah of Rachamim, of empathy, requires more from us than that. In my personal experience, the hardest thing to do in life is to understand a situation from another person's perspective. But that is exactly what empathy requires, what Judaism commands. It is why we read the Akedah, this story which is so troubling year after year. Because this is hard to do. It is hard to get. It is hard to see the person and the situation as though we were standing in their shoes. Ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Why does the text say kamocha, as yourself? Because they are as we are. We are at times like Abraham, blinded by articles of faith. And we have been Isaac, traumatized by our past. And we have been Sarah, broken and demoralized. And if we pay attention to those around us, if we are more observant Jews, observing, seeing what is hidden by shadows, by darkness, then each of us can and will be an angel in the life of another. Notice other people, I pray for it, and the challenges that they face in their lives. Understand them, please, before you judge them. Put yourself in their shoes. See the world through their eyes. Treat every person you meet as though they were your own child, and be an empathic expression of God in the world. To be a more observant Jew, as I'm using the term, as I'm defining it, means that every time you encounter a person in crisis, be they a friend, a family member, or a complete stranger, treat them as you yourself would want to be treated. Ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. Love your neighbor as you yourself want to be loved. To be a more observant Jew in this new year, and in every year, means to stand in the shoes of the person beside you, to see the world from their perspective, to understand them before you judge them, and when necessary, to be the angel who wouldn't give up, not until he rescued not only Abraham, but Isaac too. Do the right thing, the righteous thing, the Jewish thing. In this new year, in every moment, in every day, act and be with empathy. Shana Tova.